The clink of glasses and low hum of expensive conversation filled the dining hall. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble floors, while waiters in pressed uniforms moved swiftly, almost invisibly, between the crowded tables. This was the kind of restaurant where power came to eat: politicians in tailored suits, celebrities in designer gowns, and billionaires with their entourages. At the edge of the room, Aaliyah adjusted the tray in her hands. Her shoulders were straight, her steps careful, but her heart beat quickly in her chest. At 22, she had worked here long enough to know the rhythm of the place. The staff were shadows. They served, they smiled, but they were never truly seen. Aaliyah didn't mind the silence most days. She was shy, the kind of girl who spoke softly and avoided drawing attention. But her eyes missed nothing. She noticed the impatient wave of a wealthy customer when food was late, the mocking tone used by certain guests when addressing black staff. She carried those moments quietly, pressing them down, because she needed this job. Her family had always taught her to endure. Her mother, a nurse, reminded her daily, "Resilience is our inheritance. You bend, but you don't break." And her father, once a teacher, had lost his position after years of systemic bias. He used to tell Aaliyah, "Your worth isn't determined by the world's blindness. One day someone will see." Still, Aaliyah couldn't shake the truth she felt each night. In rooms like this, she was invisible. The doors to the restaurant opened wider than usual, and heads turned as Nathaniel Harrington strode in. Tall, dressed in a sleek tailored suit, he carried himself like the world owed him space. A billionaire investor, known as much for his arrogance as his wealth, Nathaniel filled the air with an energy of entitlement. He was followed by several investors, but it was the woman at his side who drew Aaliyah's eyes. Eleanor Harrington, Nathaniel's mother, walked with grace. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her gown elegant, her smile kind but quiet. And yet there was something different in her presence, something Aaliyah recognized instantly. Eleanor moved her hands subtly in patterns, her fingers shaping words in silence. American Sign Language. Aaliyah's breath caught. She hadn't used it in years, not since her childhood friend, the girl she used to sit with on the steps outside their apartment, learning to sign so she wouldn't be left out. The memory flickered in her mind, warm and bittersweet, but what she saw next made her chest ache. Nathaniel leaned down toward his mother, his voice sharp though controlled. "Just sit, Mom. Don't make this difficult tonight." Eleanor signed something back, her hands graceful, deliberate. Aaliyah caught the meaning. "I only want to be understood." Nathaniel sighed loudly, drawing the attention of the table. "No one understands you here. Just enjoy the dinner quietly." A few investors chuckled politely, looking away as if embarrassment could be ignored. Eleanor lowered her eyes, her fingers stilling against the tablecloth. Aaliyah froze where she stood, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. She had understood every word Eleanor signed. She wanted to step forward, to say something, to give Eleanor back her voice. But fear pressed heavy against her chest. What if she made a mistake? What if Nathaniel lashed out? In a place like this, a shy black waitress was expected to serve, not to speak. She forced her feet to move, delivering water to the table beside them, her head lowered. But her eyes kept drifting back to Eleanor, an elegant woman silenced not by her deafness, but by the impatience of her son and the indifference of the room. And though Aaliyah remained quiet, something inside her stirred. A small fire, faint but undeniable, that whispered, "One day you'll have to choose. Stay invisible or be brave enough to be heard." Dinner service was in full motion. Plates of roasted lamb and seared salmon glided across the room, glasses refilled before they could run dry. Laughter rose from the wealthiest tables, a sound as polished as the silverware. But at the Harrington table, tension simmered beneath the glittering surface. Nathaniel was in command of every conversation, his voice loud, his gestures sharp. He boasted about his latest investments, dropping numbers that made his guests nod with admiration. Eleanor sat quietly beside him, smiling faintly but saying little. Her hands moved a few times in small, hesitant signs. No one paid attention. Aaliyah approached with a tray of appetizers, her steps measured, her voice soft. "Excuse me, sir. Would you like to try the chef's selection tonight?" Nathaniel barely glanced at her. His eyes narrowed as if she had interrupted his stage. "Just serve the food," he said curtly. "Don't try to talk." The words hit like a slap. Heat rushed to Alia's cheeks as she lowered the tray quickly, placing the small plates in front of him. The investors chuckled politely at his dismissal, as if cruelty were part of the entertainment. One man smirked. "Efficient staff, at least." Alia's throat tightened. She bit back the urge to respond, swallowing the sting. She moved to Eleanor's side, setting down her plate with care. Eleanor looked up at her briefly, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second. There was warmth there and something else. Loneliness. Moments later, Eleanor began to sign again. Her hands moved carefully, shaping words Alia could understand. "I'd like some water, please." The waiter beside Alia froze. He stared blankly at Eleanor's hands, then back at her face. I'll check with the kitchen." Nathaniel rolled his eyes dramatically. "For God's sake, Mom, stop. No one knows what you're saying. Just don't." The table grew awkwardly silent. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably. Another sipped wine to cover the unease. Eleanor's hands stilled midair. Slowly she lowered them, folding them tightly in her lap. Her head bowed slightly, as though she'd been scolded like a child. "Really?" "Nathaniel," one woman at the table said lightly. "Don't be so harsh." "She's fine," Nathaniel insisted, waving dismissively. "She doesn't need to be making things difficult in front of my colleagues." The chuckle that followed was forced, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Eleanor sat in silence, her face pale, her expression emptied of the small joy she'd had moments before. Alia's chest ached. She had understood Eleanor perfectly. The simple request for water still lingered in her mind, burning like a truth she was too afraid to speak. Her lips parted slightly, her heart urging her to sign back, to let Eleanor know she was not alone. But fear chained her in place. She imagined Nathaniel's glare if she dared step in. She imagined laughter from the wealthy guests if she made a mistake. She imagined her manager's reprimand if she overstepped her role. In a room where her skin, her uniform, and her position already made her invisible, what chance did her voice have? So she stayed silent. She turned quickly, murmuring to the nearest waiter, "Bring her a glass of water." Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the noise of the room. By the time the glass was placed in front of Eleanor, the moment had already passed. Eleanor gave a faint, polite nod, her eyes downcast. Nathaniel had returned to his stories, laughing loudly, filling the air with his self-importance. But Alia couldn't shake the image. Eleanor's hands, graceful yet unheard. Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet pain as her son silenced her in front of everyone. Alia busied herself with serving other tables, her face composed, her movements steady. But inside, guilt churned. She had understood. She could have answered. She could have given Eleanor back her dignity, even if only for a moment. Instead, she had chosen silence. And as the night wore on, the laughter of the powerful seemed to echo louder, each sound reminding Alia of her invisibility and the cost of her fear. The restaurant closed hours later, the echoes of clinking glasses and soft piano music long gone. Alia walked home alone, her worn sneakers brushing against the cracked pavement. The city lights shimmered above her, but none of them warmed her heart. Every step replayed the moment at the table, the sharpness in Nathaniel's voice, Eleanor's lowered eyes, the silence that had fallen across the room. Most of all, Alia heard her own silence. She whispered into the night, "Why didn't I say something?" Her voice broke softly, carried away by the hum of distant traffic. At home, in the small one-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother, Alia sat on the edge of her bed. Her mother had already left for the hospital night shift, leaving behind a note on the counter. "Proud of you, always." The words cut deep. Proud for what? For standing still, for shrinking when someone needed her most. She buried her face in her hands. Images of her childhood surfaced unbidden. She was 15 again, sitting cross-legged in a small, cluttered living room beside her deaf neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. The older woman had laughed as Alia mimicked her signs, slowly learning each one. It was Mrs. Thompson who told her, "Sign language isn't just about hands, it's about dignity. When you sign back to someone, you're saying, 'I see you. You matter.'" That memory made her chest tighten with shame. She had promised herself then that she would never ignore someone's voice, no matter how it came. But in front of wealth and power, she had let fear silence her. Maybe I don't belong in their world, she whispered bitterly. Maybe no one like me ever will. Her thoughts spiraled. Every rude customer, every dismissal by coworkers, every time someone had looked at her skin and her uniform and decided she wasn't worth listening to. It wasn't just Nathaniel's words that cut her. It was the echo of every voice that had told her to stay small. Across the city, Nathaniel sat in his penthouse, pouring himself a glass of brandy. His jaw clenched as he replayed the evening. The investors had noticed his mother's silence, he could tell. They had noticed his impatience, too. That embarrassed him more than he wanted to admit. But instead of facing the discomfort, he turned it outward. It's her fault, he muttered. Always making things difficult, always reminding me. He didn't finish the sentence. The truth was too close, too raw, that his wealth had bought him everything except the ability to truly connect with his own mother. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat alone in her quiet room, journal open, pen in hand. Her handwriting flowed across the page, each word carrying weight she could never speak aloud in rooms where hands meant nothing, and sound meant everything. Tonight, I tried to sign for water. My son silenced me again, not because I cannot speak, but because he cannot listen. The world doesn't hear people like me. They smile, they nod, they move on. I am invisible even in my own family. She paused, her eyes wet with unshed tears. But then she added, there was a girl, a young waitress. She saw me. I know she understood. Her eyes told me so. But fear chained her. I wish she knew. Just one sign would have been enough to make me feel less alone. Back in her room, Aaliyah lay awake, the words of her old neighbor echoing in her head. When you sign back, you're saying, I see you. She pressed her palms together, practicing the motion for sorry in ASL, her hands trembling in the dark. She whispered to herself, next time. I won't stay quiet. I can't. But doubt still lingered, heavy as the night itself. Would she really have the courage? Or would fear steal her voice again? Days passed, but Aaliyah couldn't shake the memory of Eleanor's face, the way her hands had moved so gracefully in silence, only to be smothered by Nathaniel's impatience. Each shift at the restaurant felt heavier, her silence gnawing at her like a wound that refused to heal. Her coworker Rosa noticed. Rosa was a middle-aged Latina woman with sharp eyes and a softer heart, who had worked at the restaurant for 2 decades. She found Aaliyah folding napkins at the back station one evening, her hands trembling slightly. You're somewhere else, Rosa said, leaning against the counter. Aaliyah tried to brush it off. Just tired. But Rosa wasn't fooled. No, it's not just tired. I saw you that night with the Harringtons. You knew what Mrs. Harrington was saying, didn't you? Aaliyah froze. The napkin slipped from her hand. I wanted to help, but I was scared. What if I embarrassed her more? What if they laughed at me too? Rosa's expression softened. Mia, sometimes silence hurts more than laughter. You've got a gift. Don't bury it because you're afraid of small men with big wallets. Her words stuck like a seed in Aaliyah's chest. She carried them home, repeating them quietly before bed. The chance to act came sooner than she expected. The Harringtons returned just 3 nights later. This time, Nathaniel wasn't alone with his mother. He had brought a group of investors, men in sharp suits, women in glittering dresses, the kind of people who snapped fingers at staff and never said thank you. The private dining room buzzed with ego and champagne. The staff whispered nervously when they saw the reservation card. Nobody wanted to serve them, but the manager, eager to impress, assigned Aaliyah. Her heart dropped. Me? Yes, you, the manager said briskly. You're quiet. You won't bother them. She wanted to protest, to say she wasn't ready. But Rosa caught her eye from across the room and gave a small nod, the kind that said, this is your moment. Dinner began smoothly enough, though the air was thick with condescension. Nathaniel dominated the conversation, boasting about his latest investments while Eleanor sat silently, her hands folded in her lap. Occasionally, she signed something small. Water, thank you, no more wine. Each time, the servers froze, unsure, fumbling with awkward smiles. Finally, when Eleanor signed again, the waiter beside Aaliyah turned red and whispered, What do I do? Aaliyah's heart pounded. Fear surged, but Rosa's voice echoed in her memory. Don't bury your gift. She stepped forward. Her hands trembled, but she steadied them. Looking directly at Eleanor, she signed, "Of course, ma'am." "Would you like still water or sparkling?" The room fell into stunned silence. Eleanor's eyes widened, then glistened with tears. Slowly she signed back, "Still, please." "Thank you." Aaliyah nodded with a gentle smile and said aloud for the others to hear, "She would like still water." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the table. One of the investors raised a brow in surprise. "Well, that's unexpected." Nathaniel stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded. His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory, as if Aaliyah had trespassed into forbidden territory. "From a neighbor," Aaliyah replied softly. "When I was younger." Some of the investors chuckled under their breath, their laughter edged with mockery, not at Aaliyah, but at Nathaniel. "Imagine that," one whispered. "Your waitress knows more about your mother than you do." Nathaniel's face flushed crimson. His grip on his wineglass tightened. But Eleanor looked radiant. For the first time that evening, she straightened her posture, her hands flowing freely as she signed to Aaliyah. "It feels good to be seen," Aaliyah translated, her voice steady despite the thundering in her chest. "She says it feels good to be seen." The investors quieted. Rosa, watching from the corner, smiled proudly, whispering under her breath, "There she is." As the evening continued, Aaliyah remained at Eleanor's side, translating her signs into words. Eleanor asked questions about the business deal, offered insights from years of experience. The investors leaned in, impressed not just by her wisdom, but by the sheer dignity she carried now that her voice had been restored. Every translation Aaliyah spoke chipped away at Nathaniel's control. He sat rigid, glaring, but powerless to stop it. At one point, Eleanor signed with a small smile. "You are brave." Aaliyah's throat tightened as she whispered the translation aloud. But in her heart, she heard the words meant just for her. The dinner reached its peak. Platters of food were being cleared away, glasses refilled, and the room filled with the low hum of business talk. But every time Eleanor signed something and Aaliyah translated it, the focus shifted. The investors, powerful men and women who had arrived only to hear Nathaniel brag about profits, were now leaning toward Eleanor, listening to her wisdom. "Diversification is important," Eleanor signed thoughtfully, her hands graceful and deliberate, but never at the cost of integrity. "Short-term gains built on lies always collapse." Aaliyah repeated the words with steady clarity. Heads nodded around the table. One man even scribbled notes. Nathaniel's jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle pulsed in his cheek. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to redirect. Yes, but what my mother means is," Eleanor interrupted, her hands flashing quickly. "Don't twist my words." Aaliyah hesitated only a beat before translating. She says, "Don't twist my words." A ripple of awkward laughter spread among the guests. One woman leaned back with a smirk. "Well, looks like Mrs. Harrington has plenty to say after all." Nathaniel slammed his hand against the table, making the silverware jump. His voice rose above the polite hum of the restaurant. "Enough." The room froze, his glare snapped to Aaliyah. "You're just a waitress, a nobody. You serve food. You don't belong in this conversation. Stop filling their heads with nonsense." The words sliced through her chest. For a moment, old fear clawed at her throat. She wanted to shrink back, to disappear the way she always had. But then she felt Eleanor's gaze on her, steady, unwavering, proud. And Rosa's whisper from earlier echoed in her mind. "Don't stop. This is your moment." Aaliyah swallowed hard, then lifted her chin. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each word. "Respect doesn't come from money or titles. It comes from listening, something you've forgotten how to do, even with your own mother." The room went silent. Forks hung mid-air. Investors exchanged glances, some eyebrows raised in shock, others in admiration. Nathaniel's face turned scarlet. "How dare you?" But before he could finish, Eleanor's hands moved swiftly, passionately. Her eyes burned with years of silenced pain. Aaliyah spoke the translation, her voice breaking with emotion. "For years you've silenced me with your pride. You've treated me as a burden when I am your mother. Tonight this young woman gave me back my voice. If you cannot respect her, Nathaniel, then you will never truly lead." Gasps echoed across the table. One of the investors muttered under his breath, "She's right." Another leaned forward, nodding toward Eleanor with genuine respect. Nathaniel sputtered, his arrogance faltering under the weight of his mother's truth. You don't understand. Eleanor signed again, her hands steady as stone. Aaliyah's voice carried the words across the room like a thunderclap. No, Nathaniel. It's you who doesn't understand. Power without humility is weakness, and tonight everyone here has seen it. The blow landed harder than any raised voice could. Nathaniel sank back into his chair, silent. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but found none. The investors avoided his gaze, their respect shifting elsewhere. For once his money couldn't shield him. Eleanor reached across the table, her trembling hand finding Aaliyah's. She signed gently, her lips trembling with emotion. Thank you for hearing me. Aaliyah whispered the words, then met Eleanor's eyes. Always. The investors began to clap, soft at first, then louder until the sound filled the private room. It wasn't the applause of amusement, but of respect. Respect for a woman who had been silent too long. Respect for a waitress who had dared to stand. Aaliyah felt her chest swell with something she hadn't felt in years. Dignity. She wasn't just the shy black waitress anymore. She was a voice, a bridge, a force that even the wealthiest couldn't ignore. Rosa, peeking from the doorway, wiped a tear from her cheek. She whispered to herself, "That's my girl." Nathaniel sat frozen, his pride shattered. He reached for his glass, his hand shaking slightly, but no one looked at him anymore. Their eyes were on Eleanor and Aaliyah, the women who had taken back the room. The dinner wound down in a way no one had expected. The investors lingered, speaking not of numbers or markets, but of Eleanor's insight, and the courage it took for a waitress to bring it into the open. The air that once belonged to Nathaniel's ego now belonged to truth. As the final plates were cleared, Eleanor stood, her posture tall, her presence commanding. She signed one last time, her hands steady but filled with gratitude. Aaliyah translated softly, her voice ringing with quiet strength. Tonight I was heard, and it was because of her all eyes turned to Aaliyah. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, his usual arrogance stripped away. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck. He couldn't compete with the authenticity in the room. One of the investors stepped forward and extended his hand to Aaliyah. Young lady, you have a rare gift. Not just your skill in sign language, but your courage. People like you should never go unnoticed. Aaliyah's cheeks flushed. She lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond, but Eleanor squeezed her hand, urging her to accept the moment. Rosa slipped quietly to her side, whispering, "You did it. You showed them who you are." For once, Aaliyah didn't shrink from the spotlight. She met the investor's eyes and nodded. "Thank you. I only wanted her voice to be heard. That's all." But everyone in the room knew it was more than that. It wasn't only Eleanor's voice Aaliyah had restored. It was her own as well. News of the dinner spread quickly beyond those walls. Within days, whispers of the waitress who spoke in silence reached ears far outside the restaurant. An organization for deaf rights reached out, offering her a scholarship to train as a certified interpreter. Another investor pledged to sponsor her education if she wanted to pursue it. For Aaliyah, the offers felt surreal. She had lived so long in the shadows of invisibility that stepping into light felt almost overwhelming. But she carried her parents' lessons with her: resilience, dignity, and quiet strength. Nathaniel, though silent that night, was left to wrestle with the weight of his pride. For the first time in years, he was not the most powerful man in the room. He had watched a shy black waitress dismantle his arrogance without raising her voice. And though he couldn't admit it aloud, her courage planted something deep within him, a seed of humility he could no longer ignore. Later, when the restaurant had emptied and the city lights glowed outside, Eleanor held Aaliyah's hands one last time. She signed slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave me back my dignity. You gave me back my son, even if he doesn't see it yet." Aaliyah's throat tightened as she translated aloud for herself. "You gave me back my dignity." She hugged Eleanor, whispering, "Thank you for letting me hear you." As Aaliyah walked home beneath the cold night sky, her uniform still wrinkled, her shoes still worn, something had changed. She was still the shy waitress the world overlooked. But now she carried proof that her worth wasn't invisible. Her hands had power, her voice had value, and her silence had turned into strength. The city skyline shimmered before her, not as a barrier but as a horizon, wide open, waiting for her to claim it. The night at the Harrington dinner table became more than just a story about wealth, arrogance, or even silence. It became a story about visibility. For so long, Aaliyah had lived in the shadows, carrying her quiet strength in a world that rarely acknowledged it. She had been dismissed, underestimated, and silenced. But when the moment came, she chose courage over fear. Her choice did not simply change one evening's conversation. It reminded everyone who witnessed it, and all who later heard of it, that resilience cannot be bought and dignity cannot be denied. Aaliyah stood as proof that the people society tries hardest to overlook are often the ones carrying the greatest gifts. Eleanor Harrington, silenced for years not by her deafness but by a culture of impatience and arrogance, finally felt her voice return. She left that dinner not just as a wealthy man's mother, but as a woman restored, validated, and heard. For her, Aaliyah was not merely a waitress, she was a bridge, a lifeline, and a symbol of compassion the world desperately needed. Nathaniel's arrogance was not erased in a single night, but it was shaken. Pride had long been his armor, and money his shield. Yet in one evening, he discovered both could be stripped away by a young woman with nothing but honesty, courage, and skill. That truth unsettled him, but it also began the slow work of transformation. And for Aaliyah, the quiet girl so often ignored, the evening became a turning point. She walked away still dressed in her uniform, her shoes still worn, her life still carrying the struggles of class and race. But now she carried something more: proof. Proof that her father's lessons of resilience were alive in her. Proof that her mother's faith in her was justified. Proof that even the smallest act of courage could ripple into something far greater. She did not leave the restaurant with riches, but with something richer. Recognition. Recognition that her voice mattered, that her silence had never been weakness. It had only been waiting for the right moment to rise. The world outside that restaurant would continue to hold its injustices. Racism and prejudice would not vanish overnight. But within Aaliyah's heart, and in the lives of those who had witnessed her strength, a shift had occurred. The city lights that once reminded her of distance and exclusion now glimmered as possibility. She could see a future not shaped by invisibility, but by dignity. And with every step she took into the night, she carried with her the undeniable truth. No amount of prejudice can silence a spirit determined to be heard.